Good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana, 104.5 FM and UPTV. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I'm here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU or UCIMC, or, as we like to say on the televised version of this show, UPTV. These views are our own. And by our, in this instance, I mean myself and anyone whose views I might happen to be reading about in some of the articles that I reference throughout the program. So, I want to say a lot going on, but it's sort of a lot going on behind the scenes and not much going on in front of us that we know all that much about. So I guess I'm just going to read. There's no theme yet to this that I can see, but they all kind of revolve around the issue of what's going on right now and how people are thinking about it. So the first story is entitled, "Democrats Still Have Real Options for Immigration Reform." So Democrats' hopes of including a path to citizenship for the 8 million undocumented immigrants currently living in the U.S. in their upcoming budget reconciliation bill were dashed by a ruling from the Senate parliamentarian. It's certainly a setback, given that reconciliation looked like their best chance to pass immigration reform this year, but it doesn't mean that immigration reform has reached a dead end. Democrats have several immediate options, including presenting the parliamentarian with alternate proposals, overruling the parliamentarian, or resuming bipartisan negotiations on narrow immigration policies that at least some Republicans might find palatable. But while any of those paths could yield urgent protections for at least some groups of immigrants, none presents the opportunity to meaningfully modernize the U.S.'s broken immigration system to meet America's changing demographic and economic needs. In the long run, Democrats will likely need to build consensus around immigration issues beyond their own ranks and pass broader legislation with Republican support. Yet Congress is a long way from 2013, the last time a comprehensive immigration reform package drew significant bipartisan interest. And since that time, former President Trump has made immigration a political wedge, giving new power to the anti-immigrant wing of his party. There is still appetite among some Republicans to legalize certain populations of immigrants, such as farm workers and undocumented young people who arrived in the U.S. as children. Without Trump in office, these Republicans might be less wary of striking a deal with Democrats, but both immediate and long-term change may require Democrats to make compelling arguments to the other side, something they have not yet done. Senate parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough, an unelected staff attorney, is charged with interpreting the chamber's rules, and that includes determining what legislation can and cannot be passed via budget reconciliation, a process that requires a simple majority vote and is not subject to the filibuster. Any element of a reconciliation proposal must have a more than incidental impact on the federal budget to pass muster. Democrats had hoped to provide a path to citizenship to several key groups through reconciliation: undocumented dreamers who came to the U.S. as children, people with temporary protected status, a form of humanitarian protection typically conferred on citizens of countries suffering from natural disasters, armed conflict, or other extraordinary circumstances, farm workers, and other essential workers. Democrats had argued that precedent was on their side. In 2005, the then Republican-controlled Senate passed its own reconciliation bill, including several immigration provisions that would have effectively increased the number of green cards issued annually. Though the provisions didn't make it into the final version of the bill that was passed by the House, it would have allowed any unused green cards under the annual caps set by Congress to be issued the following year. as well as excluded the family members of foreign workers from counting toward the caps. Democrats also argued that their immigration provisions had direct budget impacts. Just providing Dreamers, TPS holders, and undocumented essential workers with a path to citizenship would increase GDP by a cumulative total of $1.5 trillion over 10 years and create 400,800 new jobs, not even accounting for the potential economic windfall for those immigrants' children, according to estimates from the Center for American Progress. The same analysis notes that after 10 years, those workers would see their annual wages increase by $13,500, and all Americans would see higher wages by an annual $600. McDonough, however, found that the impact of the legislation far outweighed its budgetary consequences, making it inappropriate to include in a reconciliation bill. Quote, "It is by any standard a broad new immigration policy," she wrote in her Sunday decision. "The reasons that people risk their lives to come to this country to escape religious and political persecution, famine, war, unspeakable violence, and lack of opportunity in their home countries cannot be measured in federal dollars." End quote. She also asserted that if she were to allow Democrats to pass the measure through reconciliation, that might be used as a precedent to justify revoking any immigrants' legal status in future reconciliation bills. Despite calls to overrule or even fire the parliamentarian, Democrats have made it clear they plan to abide by her ruling. The parliamentarian is the final word of what is and not permitted. Sorry, Bob Menendez. That's not how you say it. Let me do this the right way. This is not how he said it, but I'm just going to wing it here. The parliamentarian is the final word of what is and is not permitted under the rules. Democratic Senator Bob Menendez said in a press call on Monday. But all hope of reform isn't lost. Democrats still have viable alternative strategies they can try. Democrats are planning to field alternative immigration proposals before the parliamentarian in the hopes of inclusion in their reconciliation bill. One proposal is to update the immigration registry. Under the registry, if an immigrant has been living in the U.S. since before a certain date, they are eligible to apply for permanent residence under federal law, regardless of whether they overstayed a visa or entered the U.S. without authorization. But that date hasn't been updated in decades. It's currently January 1st, 1972. The pool of people eligible to apply for permanent residence through the registry has therefore dwindled over the years, with only 305 able to get permanent status between 2015 and 2019. But Democrats are considering advancing that date, potentially allowing millions of undocumented immigrants to attain legal status. If the date were set to 2010, some 6.7 million people would become eligible. Immigrant advocates have argued that it should be set to 2015 or earlier to ensure that Dreamers and essential workers who arrived more recently would be covered. Another option would be to set a rolling cutoff date that automatically adjusts, perhaps advancing by 1 year annually, or creating an eligibility standard requiring a certain number of years of continuously residing in the U.S. Democrats could also propose a similar change to an existing law known as Section 245I of the Immigration and Nationality Act that allows family members or employer to apply for a green card on behalf of an undocumented immigrant. It's essentially obsolete at this point because only applicants filed before April 30th, 2001 were accepted. But Democrats could advance that date. Given that more than 8 million U.S. citizens have at least one undocumented family member living with them, that small date change could have big implications. The Senate parliamentarian could reject these alternatives for the reconciliation bill, but Democrats believe she might be open to such proposals. "We're not changing the law, we're just adjusting the date. That's a dramatic difference," Menendez said. As the Senate did in 2005, Democrats could push for a provision that would allow the U.S. to recapture previously unused green cards which would go a long way toward helping applicants stuck in sometimes years-long backlogs. Hundreds of thousands of green cards allocated by Congress have gone to waste due to processing delays since 1992, and the pandemic has only worsened those delays. At this point, it seems like about 250,000 green cards, a record level, will go unused in 2021. The parliamentarian hasn't reviewed that proposal yet, given that Democrats' first priority is pursuing a legalization program in some form. Carrie Talbot, the deputy director of the advocacy group Immigration Hub, said in a press call. But recapturing cards would be a boon to immigrants already residing in the U.S. on other visas, as well as to future immigrants applying from abroad. If reconciliation proves to be an impossible vehicle for Democrats' immigration reform ambitions, they might consider going back to the negotiating table with Republicans. Bipartisan talks on immigration reform, led by Republican Senators Lindsey Graham and John Cornyn, and Democratic Senators Dick Durbin and Menendez, hit a wall in May after Republicans said they wouldn't move forward unless Biden started implementing stricter control over the southern border. In reality, Biden has been tough on the border, maintaining some Trump-era policies over the objections of immigrant advocates. Republicans have nevertheless sought to paint him as an open borders Democrat, perhaps foreshadowing a line of attack in next year's midterm elections. But there have previously been glimmers of potential common ground, glimmers strong enough to be promising. In March, the House passed 2 bipartisan immigration bills to legalize Dreamers and other humanitarian protectees, as well as farm workers. 9 Republicans joined Democrats to pass the Dream and Promise Act by a vote of 228 to 197. The Farm Workforce Modernization Act also passed 247 to 174, backed by 30 Republicans. The bills narrowly addressed immigrant populations perceived as sympathetic by at least some members of both parties. In April, Cornyn and Senator Kyrsten Sinema, a Democrat from Arizona, introduced a bipartisan bill to revamp the way that migrants are processed at the border. Among other provisions, it would have fast-tracked asylum screenings such as they would only take 72 hours, a controversial provision that immigrant advocates argue would come at the expense of asylum seekers' due process rights. It would also create 4 regional processing centers to house migrants arriving on the border that would effectively function as detention centers. Though the Cornyn-Sinema proposal didn't go anywhere and had provisions that raised serious humanitarian concerns, there were aspects of it that might provide a starting point for future negotiations. The Afghanistan crisis has also recently provided an opportunity for bipartisan action on immigration. Though some in the Republican Party have objected to the resettlement of Afghans in the U.S., members of both parties rushed to pass legislation speeding up efforts to process Afghans who aided the 20-year U.S. war effort, increasing the number of available visas for them and easing some of the eligibility requirements. The July vote in the House was 407 to 16. Democrats could try to harness some of the energy around resettling Afghans and use it to advocate for other similarly vulnerable groups of immigrants. Our sense is that there's still a number of Republicans who would be willing to sit down and strike a deal, said Ali Noorani, president of the National Immigration Forum. The challenge for both parties is to say, is this a problem we actually want to address? Even if Democrats were able to pass their proposed path to citizenship via reconciliation, a measure that would have brought relief to a large proportion of the undocumented population, it would not have completely fixed the U.S. immigration system's long-standing flaws. Much like the last time Congress legalized millions of undocumented immigrants in 1986, Democrats' path to citizenship proposal didn't address future immigration, just the immediate problem of people who are already living in the U.S. without legal status. That was considered a major flaw of the 1986 law, which failed to resolve the challenge of unauthorized immigration for good, given that the undocumented population in the U.S. has more than quadrupled in the intervening years. To pass that kind of forward-looking legislation, Democrats need to get 60 votes in the Senate. For the foreseeable future, without filibuster reform, that means getting 10 Republicans to sign on. They therefore can't afford just to rely on interest in immigration reform among their own ranks. They also need to find a way to reach Republicans who haven't historically supported increasing immigration. Noorani said he believes that the way to do that is to make a shrewd economic and demographic argument for immigration, particularly at a local level. Economists broadly agree that population growth fuels economic growth in wealthy countries, but the U.S. has seen dramatic decreases in population growth, and some parts of the U.S. are already beginning to experience some of the downside. Shrinking tax bases in rural areas have made it harder for government budget to support essential services, such as infrastructure and public schools. As population growth slows, the pressure for cuts will likely grow. Meanwhile, the existing population continues to age. By 2030, the Census Bureau estimates that 1 in 5 U.S. residents will be of retirement age. With 80% of Americans living in counties that lost population over the past decade, it's likely that local chambers of commerce and school superintendents will increasingly be feeling the pinch and might be open to immigration as a solution. In his research with Danilo Zak, also of the National Immigration Forum, Noorani argues that the U.S. should increase net immigration levels by at least 37%, or about 370,000 additional immigrants a year, to prevent a demographic deficit stemming from low population growth. It's really hard to see how, socially and economically, we continue to thrive as a country if such large swaths of our geography are losing population, Noorani said. We've got to be thinking about these issues through the prism of somebody's checkbook and what they and their families want to do over the course of the next 5, 10, or 15 years. Democrats could and should do far more to harness this case for immigration, particularly to sway Republicans representing conservative rural districts, as well as those sensitive to the needs of small businesses. In recent years, the GOP has worked to position itself as the party with greater insight into what is good for the U.S. economy, from advocating for personal and corporate tax cuts during the Trump administration, to more recently issuing warnings about federal spending in the Biden administration. There is a case for immigration that speaks to the Republican economic worldview, and it's up to the Democrats to make it. I will, yeah. I mean, the problem, though, this is my editorial on that column there. The problem is that assumes that people behave logically. And as we have seen, certainly over the last 4 years during the Trump era, that is not necessarily the case. One could have, prior to Trump, argued that all the characteristics of a president like Trump would be anathema to Republican voters. Lacks morals, constantly lying about things, really bad behavior, unpleasant personality, all those different things that I think a lot of Republicans would agree are characteristics of Trump. Somehow, suddenly just vanished. All those things just apparently didn't seem to matter in the pursuit of some kind of weird right to be right, if that makes sense. It wasn't ideology, really. It was tribalism in the general sense of the word. It was people drawing together and saying, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. And therefore, whatever they want, we don't want. And it that has included immigration to a great extent. So I don't see very many Republicans being open to reason-based, logical arguments. Which is not to say that the politicians are not amenable to those arguments, but they know their voters, and they know that the loudest, strongest support group are people that just are basically no to anything that the left wants. So I can't see a logic-based argument doing any good. I just can't see it happening. I don't know. I could be wrong. I would like to be wrong. I would like to think that there will be an increasing number of Republicans over the next few years who will come out and say, you know what, we reject the Trump era and we reject those kinds of divisive policies, and we want to bring the nation together and people together and work with all the different sides to create good policy. But at the moment, that's not going to happen, and that's not happening. And their base would just, hang them from the nearest tree. Honestly, they would just string them up because they hate. I mean, they're whipped into a frenzy of hate. Trump spent 4 years doing that, and a lot of the right-wing media has just jumped on that bandwagon, and just the Rush Limbaugh's thankfully gone now, and others. They just push that. Anything the left wants is socialism. It's communism. They hate you and they want you to die. I mean, that's their logic. So, that's not everybody that's a Republican. I'm not saying that, but they're the strongest, loudest voices on that side of the aisle at this time. That's how they think and they feel. And you can see it in their statements and their behavior. I just don't see it working. Anyway, it would be nice. Okay, our next article is entitled, Protesters Press Congress for Path to Citizenship as Democrats Plan Its Obstacles. So this is another article about the same general topic, and we'll see what they have to say. So this was finally a moment of hope for Pavel. There we go. Couldn't read it. Pavel Mena, an undocumented immigrant who has been living in the United States for 6 years. He saw Democratic leaders pushing to insert sweeping immigration provisions in their $3.5 trillion budget package and believed the long-awaited promise of a pathway to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants in the United States would finally happen. But on Sunday, the Senate parliamentarian, evaluating whether the immigration measure was sufficiently budget-related for a package Democrats want to pass in a process called reconciliation to avoid a GOP filibuster, advised against it, ruling that it was not appropriate for inclusion. Mena disagreed with that assessment. He said he pays taxes with an IRS-issued individual taxpayer identification number, or an ITIN, as they are known, because he is unable to receive a Social Security number, and he has continued to work in construction during the pandemic as an essential worker doing waterproofing. On Tuesday, Mena stood at the front of a crowd of thousands of immigrants and supporters from across the country in Washington to push back, demanding that Congress include a pathway to citizenship in the budget package and emphasizing the crucial role of immigrants in the U.S. economy. We are contributing to the economy, and we already prove it, said Mena, 40, of Razortown, Maryland, who is the sole provider for his pregnant wife, children ages 15, 9, and 19 months, and mother-in-law. We're valuable here to pay taxes. We're valuable here to help build the economy, and they even call us essential. Democrats planned to create a path to legal residency and then U.S. citizenship for as many as 8 million of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the country by including the measure in their budget reconciliation package because it requires only a simple majority to pass, allowing them to push it through without Republican support. However, parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough, a nonpartisan arbiter of the Senate's rules, said that granting legal residency to millions of immigrants would be a tremendous and enduring policy change that dwarfs its budgetary impact. Republicans applauded the decision, while Senate Democrats and immigrant advocates said they would keep pushing immigration reform in the budget plan and exploring alternative proposals. Demonstrators called out the parliamentarians' ruling specifically in speeches and signs during the Welcome Back Congress, March for Citizenship, Care, and Climate rally. They also pressed Congress to pass ambitious climate legislation and support caregivers like domestic workers, arguing these issues disproportionately affect communities of color. Protesters included immigrants with temporary protected status, deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA recipients, and people who are undocumented, all demanding that the Biden administration and congressional Democrats deliver on a pathway to citizenship. They marched from Benjamin Banneker Park by the Potomac River to the headquarters of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and finally, the Capitol Reflecting Pool. Outside ICE headquarters on Tuesday afternoon, someone in the crowd began playing the Spanish-Portuguese hit song Danza Kuduro, and Maria Ana Bolanos, 57, started to move. She banged on a pot with a drumstick to the beat. A crowd formed a circle around the mother of four from Annandale, Virginia, and cheered as she danced in front of the headquarters of the agency that has deported many undocumented immigrants. Bolaños, who is from El Salvador, wore a shirt that read CASA, a Latino and immigrant organization that was one of many behind the march, as well as the phrase Si se puede, Spanish for yes, we can. After dancing in the streets in the nation's capital on Tuesday, Bolanos said she felt happy and powerful. For 4 years under the Trump administration, Luis Aguilar, the Virginia director for CASA, said immigrants felt like enemies of the country. President Donald Trump tried to wall off the United States with physical barricades across borderlands and directives that separated migrant children from parents. The government, Aguilar said, did as much as possible to remove and silence immigrants. At least now, Aguilar said, under the Biden administration, he feels the community can protest for a potential solution. He said a pathway to citizenship should be included in the budget reconciliation package because of the way immigrants contribute to the nation's economy, and he rejected the parliamentarians' ruling. If our futures here had no economic impact, then we would not be taxed, Aguilar said. It's another signaling that this population is invisible to this society. Maria Chavalan-Sut, an indigenous Mayan woman from Guatemala and mother of four, sat on the grass as speakers took the stage outside the Capitol. The 47-year-old thought of her own journey to seek asylum in the United States, how it started with ICE detention, a missed court date she never knew she had, an ankle monitor, and the threat of deportation, before she was finally given sanctuary at Wesley Memorial United Methodist Church in Charlottesville on September 30th, 2018. She doesn't want leaders to forget about the undocumented immigrants who sheltered in sanctuary churches for years under Trump, like she did, and hopes they pass legislation to provide a pathway to citizenship for everyone.